Imagine a nation torn apart, brothers facing brothers on blood-soaked fields and a fight that would decide the very soul of America. From the first cannon at Fort Sumter to the fall of Lee at Appomattox, this is the story of courage, sacrifice, and a struggle for freedom that changed the world forever. Stay with us, because what you're about to see will reveal the untold truths, the human stories, and the shocking moments of the American Civil War like never before. We'll explain everything in this video, step by step. Don't skip it. In the early spring of 1861, America was not yet a battlefield, but it was already a broken heart. For decades, the nation had lived with a contradiction stitched into its very foundation. A republic built on liberty, and an economy built at least in part on human bondage. The arguments had filled courtrooms and churches, newspapers and dinner tables. Compromises had postponed the reckoning, not prevented it. And by the time Abraham Lincoln placed his hand on the Bible and became the 16th president, the country was already pulling itself apart. 7 southern states had seceded before Lincoln even took office. They did not leave quietly. They left convinced that their way of life, their political power, and their economic survival depended on it. Slavery was not the only issue, but it was the central one, the engine that drove fear, wealth, and identity. Two Americas now faced each other, each claiming to be the true heir of the Revolution. The war began not with marching armies, but with cannon fire echoing across Charleston Harbor. On April 12, 1861, Confederate guns opened fire on Fort Sumter. The fort fell, but something far larger rose in its place: total war. Lincoln called for volunteers. The South rallied to defend its new Confederacy. Men who had grown up under the same flag now put on different uniforms and aimed rifles at former neighbors. Brothers would fight brothers. Fathers would bury sons. And the war would last far longer and cost far more than anyone imagined at first. Both sides believed victory would be swift. The North had industry, railroads, factories, and a larger population. The South had experienced military leadership, a defensive mindset, and the belief that fighting on home soil would break Northern will. Early battles shattered illusions on both sides. At Bull Run, spectators came to watch what they thought would be a spectacle. They fled in terror as chaos swallowed the battlefield. It was the first lesson of the Civil War. This would not be glorious. This war would be intimate. Soldiers slept in mud, ate hardtack, crawling with insects, and marched until their feet bled. Disease killed more men than bullets. Surgeons worked with saws and speed, amputating limbs without anesthesia. Letters home carried hope, fear, and often a final goodbye. Every town felt the war. Every family counted the cost. The Confederacy found its champion in General Robert E. Lee, brilliant, restrained, and deeply conflicted. He opposed secession in principle, but could not raise his sword against Virginia, his home. The Union struggled at first to find a commander who could match Lee's audacity. Battles like Antietam, Shiloh, and Fredericksburg left fields soaked in blood with no decisive end in sight. Antietam, fought in September 1862, became the single bloodiest day in American history. Over 22,000 casualties in one day. The sun rose on cornfields and set on mass graves. Yet strategically, it gave Lincoln something he had been waiting for, not a triumph, but an opening. With it, he issued the Emancipation Proclamation. It did not free all enslaved people immediately, but it changed the soul of the war. No longer was this conflict only about preserving the Union. It was now openly a war for freedom. Enslaved men and women fled plantations, crossed Union lines, and transformed the struggle with their courage. Nearly 180,000 black soldiers would eventually fight for the Union, proving on battlefields what they had always known, that liberty was worth dying for. The war grew darker, harder, more ruthless. In 1863, the armies collided at Gettysburg. 3 days of fighting decided the fate of the Confederacy's greatest offensive. Pickets charged thousands of men advancing across open ground into rifle and cannon fire was not just a military disaster. It was the moment the South's hopes began to bleed away. At the same time, the Union captured Vicksburg, splitting the Confederacy in two along the Mississippi River. Still, the war refused to end. Lincoln found his general in Ulysses S. Grant, a man who understood that the Union could win only by breaking the Confederacy's ability to fight. Grant coordinated relentless campaigns. William Tecumseh Sherman marched through Georgia, burning railroads, destroying supply lines, and bringing war to civilians. It was brutal, intentional, and effective. The message was clear. This war would not be won by honor alone, but by exhaustion. By 1864, the Confederacy was starving. Its cities crumbled. Its soldiers fought on with courage and despair. Lee's army dwindled, surrounded by forces it could no longer repel. On April 9, 1865, at Appomattox Courthouse, Lee surrendered to Grant. The war was over, but peace did not arrive easily. 5 days later, Abraham Lincoln was assassinated. The man who had carried the nation through its darkest trial was gone, just as the work of healing was about to begin. The Civil War had killed over 600,000 Americans. It had destroyed cities, families, and illusions. It had ended slavery, but not racism. It had preserved the Union, but left deep scars that would last generations. The Civil War was not just a clash of armies. It was a test of an idea. Could a nation dedicated to equality survive its own contradictions? Could freedom be expanded without tearing the country apart? The answers were written not only in constitutions and amendments, in blood and sacrifice. From 1861 to 1865, America learned that unity is fragile, that democracy demands struggle, and that the cost of ignoring injustice is always higher than confronting it. The echoes of the Civil War still live in American memory, not as a distant past, but as a warning and a lesson written into the soul of the nation. Long before the first cannon roared over Charleston Harbor, the United States was already at war with itself. The conflict did not begin in 1861. It had been quietly growing since the nation's birth, buried inside its founding promises and moral compromises. From the very beginning, America carried two opposing ideas in the same body: that all men were created equal and that millions of human beings could be owned, bought, and sold. For decades, the country survived by refusing to look directly at that contradiction, pushing it westward, delaying it with political deals, pretending it could be contained. Every new state added to the Union reopened the wound. Would it be free or slave? Each decision threatened to tip the balance of power. The Missouri Compromise, the Compromise of 1850, the Kansas-Nebraska Act. These were not solutions, but pauses in an argument growing louder and more bitter. In Congress, debates turned into insults, then into violence. On the Senate floor, Charles Sumter was beaten nearly to death with a cane for speaking against slavery. Words were no longer enough. The South built its economy on enslaved labor in it. Its identity on a rigid social hierarchy. Wealth, political power, and personal honor became tied to the preservation of slavery. To question it was not merely to challenge an institution, but to challenge an entire way of life. Many white Southerners feared that without slavery, their world would collapse economically, ruined, socially overturned, and politically dominated by the North. That fear hardened into defiance. The North was not united in moral clarity. Many opposed slavery not because they believed in racial equality, but because they feared its expansion would threaten free labor and opportunity for white workers. Others simply wanted to preserve the Union at all costs, even if slavery survived. Yet over time, abolitionist voices grew stronger. Newspapers printed graphic accounts of brutality. Escaped enslaved people told their story. Harriet Beecher Stowe's Uncle Tom's Cabin reached millions, turning distant suffering into something personal and unavoidable. As emotions intensified, trust between North and South eroded. Southerners came to see Northern criticism as an attack on their honor and sovereignty. Northerners increasingly viewed Southern leaders as aggressors, holding the nation hostage to human bondage. The federal government, meant to bind the states together, became a battleground itself. Each election felt existential. Each court ruling felt like a declaration of war, the Supreme Court's dread. Scott's decision in 1857 delivered a devastating blow. It declared that black Americans could not be citizens and that Congress had no authority to prohibit slavery in the territories. To many in the North, it proved that the system was rigged in favor of slaveholding power. To many in the South, it was validation and still not enough. Compromise no longer satisfied either side. When Abraham Lincoln emerged as a national figure, he represented a threat not because he called for immediate abolition, but because he challenged slavery's expansion. His belief that the nation could not endure permanently half slave and half free struck at the heart of Southern fears. The election of 1860 became the breaking point. Lincoln won without carrying a single Southern state. To the South, this was proof that their political influence within the Union was finished. Secession followed swiftly. South Carolina led the way, declaring that the Union no longer protected its interests. Other states followed, not all for the same reasons, but all bound by shared fear and resentment. They did not see themselves as rebels. They saw themselves as heirs to the American Revolution, defending self-rule against a hostile government. They formed the Confederate States of America, wrote a constitution that explicitly protected slavery, and prepared for conflict. Meanwhile, in the North, shock mixed with disbelief. Many could not imagine the Union dissolving by choice. The idea that states could simply leave challenged the very foundation of American democracy. Lincoln, and still weeks away from taking office, watched the nation unravel with limited power to stop it. He believed secession was illegal, but he also knew that force could drive the country into catastrophe. Families argued around dinner tables. Churches split. Newspapers inflamed passions. In border states, loyalties were torn apart. Men who had served together in the U.S. Army quietly chose sides, knowing they might soon face each other across a battlefield. The nation was no longer debating policy. It was deciding identity. Was America a single, indivisible nation, or a temporary alliance of sovereign states? The final moment came at Fort Sumter. The fort itself was of little strategic value, but its symbolism was immense. When Confederate guns opened fire, they did more than attack a military installation. They shattered the last illusion that this crisis could be resolved without bloodshed. The country crossed a line from which it could not return, yet even as war began, the divide was not clean or simple. Not all Southerners supported secession. Not all Northerners supported war. Enslaved people had no vote at all, yet they stood to gain or lose everything. The conflict was layered with contradictions, economic, moral, political, and deeply personal. It was not a battle between good and evil alone, but a collision of fears, ambitions, and unresolved sins. The nation that entered 1861 was already fractured in spirit. The war did not create the division, it exposed it. The battle, fields that would soon fill with bodies, were only physical reflection of a struggle that had been raging in hearts and minds for generations. What began as a political crisis had become an unavoidable reckoning driven by the refusal to confront injustice early, the failure of compromise to heal moral wounds, and the growing certainty on both sides that survival itself was at stake, that only force could now decide what kind of nation America was meant to be, whether unity could be preserved without surrendering conscience, whether freedom could expand without tearing the country apart, whether a republic founded on ideals could survive the weight of its own contradiction. As millions stood waiting, watching, and bracing themselves for a war that would redefine everything they believed the United States was supposed to represent. When the first volunteers marched off to war, many believed the fighting would be brief and decisive, a test of courage that would end by winter. Young men posed proudly for photographs, their uniforms clean, their faces confident. Bands played patriotic songs as crowds cheered, certain that honor and enthusiasm would be enough. None of them yet understood that this war would not remain distant or abstract. It would reach into their bodies, their minds, and their homes, turning the lives of ordinary people into instruments of survival. The Civil War was not fought by professional soldiers alone. It was fought by farmers, clerks, teachers, and laborers who traded plows and ledgers for rifles. They learned quickly that war was not made of heroic charges and clean victories, but of endless waiting, hunger, exhaustion, and fear. Camps were filthy, water was contaminated, and disease spread faster than bullets. Dysentery, typhoid, and pneumonia killed men who never saw the enemy, their names fading quietly from memory without the sound of a gunshot. Marching itself became a form of suffering. Soldiers walked mile after mile under crushing heat or freezing rain, carrying heavy packs that tore into their shoulders. Shoes disintegrated. Feet blistered and bled. Sleep came in short, uneasy stretches broken by alarms and nightmares. The landscape of America, once familiar and comforting, became hostile fields that concealed enemy fire, forests that echoed with unseen movement, rivers that swallowed men and horses alike. When battle finally came, it was sudden and terrifying. Smoke filled the air, blinding men and turning commands into confusion. Rifles cracked with mechanical precision, cutting down bodies at distances that shocked those raised on older notions of warfare. Artillery ripped apart ranks in seconds, leaving nothing but screams and fragments where men had stood. Courage existed, but so did panic. Some froze, some ran, some fought because there was nowhere else to go. The wounds. The Civil War were unlike those of any previous American conflict. Many balls shattered bones rather than piercing cleanly, forcing Sioux Rajans to amputate limbs to save lives. Field hospitals overflowed. Blood soaked into the ground as men waited hours or days for treatment. There was little anesthesia, little understanding of infection. The saw became a symbol of mercy and terror at once. Survival often meant a lifetime of disability, pain, and dependence. Yet the physical suffering was only part of the war's cruelty. Soldiers carried emotional burdens that no uniform could protect them from. They watched friends die inches away, heard final words whispered in shock and disbelief, and buried bodies hurriedly before moving on. Many learned to harden themselves just to continue functioning. Others broke under the strain, their minds overwhelmed by constant exposure to death. There was no language yet for trauma, no recognition of what we would later call psychological wounds. Home offered no true escape. Letters traveled slowly, if they arrived at all. Families waited weeks or months for news, reading and rereading each line until the paper wore thin. Mothers scanned casualty lists with dread. Wives learned to live with uncertainty as a permanent condition. Children grew up with fathers absent or changed beyond recognition. Entire communities measured time not by seasons, but by who had not returned. Civilians were not spectators in this war. Armies moved through towns and farms, consuming food, livestock, and shelter. Fields were trampled, homes were burned, railroads were destroyed. The line between battlefield and home front dissolved. Women took on new roles, running farms, managing businesses, and organizing aid. They became nurses, sewing bandages, cleaning wounds, and offering comfort in overcrowded hospitals where death was a daily presence. Enslaved people experienced the war in deeply personal and dangerous ways. As armies approached, many seized the chance to flee, risking punishment or death in pursuit of freedom. Others were forced to labor for the Confederate war effort, building fortifications or tending camps. The arrival of Union troops did not always bring immediate safety, but it brought possibility. Freedom became something to be claimed, not just promised. The war forced individuals to confront choices that defined their humanity. Soldiers decided whether to show mercy or cruelty. Civilians chose whether to help neighbors or betray them. Loyalties shifted under pressure. In border states, families split along political lines, living in constant suspicion. The idea of a shared national identity fractured into something raw and local, measured by who could be trusted and who could not. As the fighting dragged on year after year, enthusiasm gave way to endurance. Veterans no longer spoke of glory, they spoke of survival. Replacements arrived younger and less prepared, absorbing the shock of combat with widened eyes. The war aged men quickly, carving lines into faces that would never fully soften again. Even those who lived carried the conflict inside them. Replay. Moments they could not forget. Religion offered comfort to some and questions to others. Ministers preached sacrifice and divine purpose, while soldiers wondered why God allowed such suffering. Prayer mingled with doubt. Faith was tested in the presence of mass death, and beliefs were reshaped by the realities of violence. The war did not simply kill bodies, it challenged meaning itself. By the time the conflict reached its later stages, the idea of war as an adventure had vanished entirely. It had become a grinding force that consumed everything it touched. The American Civil War transformed ordinary people into witnesses of horror and resilience. It blurred the line between soldier and civilian, front line and home front, physical survival and emotional endurance. The war was no longer something that happened elsewhere. It lived in amputated limbs, empty chairs at dinner tables, letters stained with tears, and memories that refused to fade. An entire generation learned through pain that war is not fought only with weapons, but with human lives stretched to their breaking point, reshaping identities, relationships, and the meaning of sacrifice in ways that would echo long after the gun fell silently. In the early years of the Civil War, freedom remained a distant promise rather than an official purpose. The Union marched to preserve the nation, not to destroy slavery. Abraham Lincoln understood the fragile balance he was forced to maintain. Border states still allowed slavery but had not seceded, and pushing too far, too fast, risked driving them into the Confederacy. For enslaved people, this hesitation was devastating. The war raged around them, yet their chains remained legally intact, even as they sensed that history was shifting beneath their feet. Still, enslaved men and women acted before the government did. As Union armies advanced into Southern territory, people began escaping plantations in growing numbers. They crossed rivers at night, followed railroad tracks, and trusted whispered directions passed between strangers. When they reached Union lines, they were not always welcomed as heroes. They were labeled contraband, a legal term that reduced human beings to seized property. But even in that dehumanizing language, there was change. The war had cracked open the system, and enslaved people were forcing the nation to confront the reality it had long avoided. These refugees transformed the Union war effort. They brought intelligence about terrain, troop movements, and supply routes. They worked as laborers, cooks, teamsters, and nurses. Their presence made it increasingly impossible to deny the connection between the war and slavery. Every escape weakened the Confederate economy. Every step toward Union lines made neutrality on the issue of bondage harder to defend. The war was already becoming a struggle over freedom, whether leaders admitted it or not. Lincoln watched this transformation with careful calculation and growing moral urgency. He understood that emancipation could redefine the war both domestically and internationally. European powers, especially Britain and France, might recognize the Confederacy if the conflict remained a political struggle between states. But a war openly fought against slavery would be far harder to support. Emancipation could also prevent foreign intervention while strengthening the Union's moral authority. After the bloody stalemate at Antietam in September 1862, Lincoln seized the moment. He announced the Emancipation Proclamation, declaring that enslaved people and states still in rebellion would be free as of January 1st, 1863. It was not a perfect or complete act. Slavery remained legal in loyal border states and areas already under Union control, but the symbolism was unmistakable. The United States government had formally aligned itself with freedom for enslaved people. The Proclamation was a thunderclap heard across plantations and cities alike. Word spread through songs, sermons, and whispered conversation. Freedom was no longer just a hope carried in the heart. It was now written into law, backed by the force of Union arms. Many did not wait for Union soldiers to arrive. They walked off plantations the moment the proclamation took effect, turning paper words into living action. The war itself changed character almost immediately. Black men began to enlist in the Union Army, first cautiously, then in overwhelming numbers. By the end of the war, nearly 880,000 black soldiers and sailors had served. They fought not only Confederate armies, but also prejudice within the Union ranks. They were often paid less, given poor equipment, and assigned the most dangerous duties. Still, they volunteered, understanding that service was both a claim to freedom and a demand for recognition. On the battlefield, black soldiers proved their courage again and again. At Fort Wagner, the 54th Massachusetts led a desperate assault against heavily fortified Confederate positions. They suffered devastating losses, but their bravery shattered doubts about black soldiers' willingness and ability to fight. Newspapers that once mocked the idea now praised their discipline and resolve. Blood spilled in uniform became an argument no speech could silence. The Confederacy responded with fury and fear. Captured black soldiers were often executed or sold back into slavery rather than treated as prisoners of war. This brutality exposed the true stakes of the conflict. For black Americans, defeat meant a return to bondage or death. Victory meant the possibility of citizenship, dignity, and self-determination. The war was no longer about abstract political structures. It was about survival. Emancipation also forced white Americans in the North to confront uncomfortable truths. Many who had opposed slavery's expansion were not prepared to accept black equality. The presence of freed people in northern cities sparked resentment and violence. Riots erupted, most infamously in New York City in 1863, where white mobs attacked black residents and Union institutions alike. Freedom challenged existing hierarchies, and not everyone welcomed the change. Yet, despite resistance, the moral sare of the war had shifted permanently. Soldiers wrote home, describing enslaved families seeking protection behind Union lines. Ministers reframed sermons around liberation. Politicians spoke more openly about a nation reborn. Lincoln himself evolved, recognizing that preserving the Union and ending slavery were no longer separate goals. They were bound together. The Emancipation Proclamation did not end slavery overnight, but it set a course that could not be reversed. It ensured that any Union victory would mean the destruction of the institution that had defined America's greatest contradiction. It turned enslaved people into agents of their own liberation and soldiers into instruments of a broader human cause. The war gained a new meaning, one that reached beyond borders and generations. By the time the conflict neared its end, emancipation was no longer just a wartime measure. It had become a promise that demanded permanence. The passage of the 13th Amendment would later seal that promise into the Constitution, abolishing slavery everywhere in the United States. But even before the amendment, the reality on the ground had already changed. Freedom had been claimed, defended, and written in sacrifice. The transformation of the Civil War through emancipation revealed a truth long denied. A nation cannot fight for unity while ignoring injustice at its core. The war became a test not only of military strength, but of moral courage. Through emancipation, the conflict was lifted from a struggle over territory and governance into a defining moment of human liberation, reshaping the meaning of citizenship, redefining the purpose of government, and forcing America to confront who it was willing to include in its promise of liberty as enslaved people, stepped forward from the shadows of history and placed themselves at the very center of the nation's unfinished revolution. By 1863, the American Civil War had already consumed 2 years of lives, land, and hope, and yet neither side had achieved the decisive victory they had envisioned. Both the Union and the Confederacy had endured staggering losses, but the conflict refused to bend to expectation. Battles raged across fields and forests, and the fates of armies were often decided by moments of courage, miscalculation, and sheer chance. It was in this year that the tide of the war began to shift, turning toward the Union through battles that would become legendary in American memory and through strategy that revealed the harsh reality that victory required not just bravery, but relentless endurance, coordination, and sometimes cruelty. Gettysburg was the first of these defining moments. In July of 1863, Lee led his Army of Northern Virginia north, deep into Union territory, seeking to strike a decisive blow on enemy soil and to sway public opinion in the North against continuing the war. The three-day clash that followed became the largest battle ever fought on American soil, involving more than 160,000 soldiers in a struggle that would leave nearly 50,000 men dead, wounded, or missing. The terrain, rolling hills, dense woods, and open fields turned ordinary maneuvers into deadly gambits. When Pickett's charge attempted to pierce the Union lines on the final day, thousands of Confederate soldiers advanced across open ground under devastating fire. Courage met inevitability, bravery met bloodshed. The failure of that assault marked not only a Confederate defeat, but the beginning of a psychological turning point. Lee had lost his momentum, and the dream of forcing a political settlement in the North had been shattered. Meanwhile, the Union forces were achieving a different kind of victory farther west. In Vicksburg, Mississippi, General Ulysses S. Grant executed a campaign of attrition and siege that demonstrated the growing strategic sophistication of the Union Army. Vicksburg had been a fortress controlling the Mississippi River, vital for both commerce and military movement. And Grant surrounded the city, cutting off supplies, and subjected it to constant bombardment. Civilians and soldiers alike endured starvation, exhaustion, and despair. But surrender became inevitable. On July 4th, 1863, Vicksburg fell, effectively splitting the Confederacy in two and securing Union control of the river. These twin victories, the repulse of Lee at Gettysburg and the capture of Vicksburg, represent not just battlefield success, but the collapse of Confederate strategic initiative. The significance of these battles went beyond tactics. They demonstrated that the war was no longer merely a contest of strength or morale. The Union was learning to coordinate multiple theaters of operation, to combine Army, Navy, and logistical support into an integrated campaign. It was beginning to leverage its industrial advantage, its superior manpower, and the moral weight of emancipation to create momentum that the Confederacy could not match. Yet, even in victory, the cost was undeniable. Fields were littered with corpses, towns were scarred, families waited desperately for news. The human toll made every advance bittersweet, a reminder that strategy could win battles but could never erase the suffering inflicted by them. Grant's approach to warfare embodied this transformation. He understood that a protracted war of maneuver and attrition could break the Confederacy, even if individual battles were bloody and costly. He pushed relentlessly against enemy positions, understanding that sustained pressure would exhaust both men and resources. In the East, he coordinated with General William Tecumseh Sherman in the West, ensuring that multiple fronts strained Confederate logistics simultaneously. This kind of strategic thinking signaled a departure from earlier approaches, where single victories were expected to decide campaigns. Now, the Union understood that endurance, combined with moral and material leverage, could achieve what isolated heroics never could. Sherman, for his part, demonstrated the psychological, as well as the physical dimensions of modern warfare. His campaigns through Georgia, particularly the infamous March to the Sea, embraced the doctrine of total war, targeting not only Confederate armies, but the infrastructure, supply lines, and morale of civilian population. Railroads were destroyed, crops were burned, and towns were laid waste not indiscriminately, but systematically. Sherman believed that the Southern will to fight depended on sustaining its armies and economy. And by attacking those foundations, the Confederacy could be compelled to surrender. This approach, harsh and controversial, reflected the evolution of the war into something far more comprehensive than mere combat between armies. Victory was now measured not only in battlefield success, but in the ability to break the opponent's capacity to resist. The political consequences of these military campaigns were equally profound. Each Union success strengthened Lincoln's position at home and abroad. It reinforced the moral justification of emancipation, proving that the fight for freedom was inseparable from the fight to preserve the nation. International observers, particularly in Britain and France, where recognition of the Confederacy had been under consideration, saw that the war was shifting decisively against the South. These victories reassured the Northern public, who had grown weary of the long and bloody struggle, and provided momentum for continued support of a war that demanded enormous sacrifice. Yet the Confederate response was one of resilience and improvisation, even as resources dwindled and morale faltered. Lee's army, though diminished, continued to fight with tactical brilliance, making defensive campaigns that delayed Union advances and inflicted significant casualties. Southern commanders improvised, leveraging knowledge of local terrain, exploiting overconfidence among Union forces, and attempting bold maneuvers to regain lost initiative. Each Confederate effort demonstrated that the struggle was far from over, that the determination to fight, even in the face of overwhelming odds, remained a defining characteristic of the war. The cumulative effect of Gettysburg, Vicksburg, and Grant's campaigns was the emergence of a Union advantage that combined material superiority, strategic coordination, and moral clarity. The Confederacy could no longer rely on early assumptions of swift victories or the inevitability of European-esque upward. Each defeat chipped away at their hopes, was simultaneously strengthening the resolve of Northern forces and the enslaved people whose liberation had become intertwined with the Union cause. The war had shifted from a series of isolated engagements into a sustained, coordinated effort aimed at not only defeating armies, but transforming the very social and political landscape of the South. Amid these campaigns, ordinary soldiers, civilians, freed people bore witness to both the brutality and the purpose of the conflict. Men endure unimaginable hardships in trenches, camps, and on forced marches. Civilians suffered the consequences of armies moving through their towns and farms. Enslaved men and women fled bondage to claim freedom and join the fight. The war's scope had expanded far beyond early expectations, encompassing not only military objectives, but social change, moral imperatives, and the reconstruction of the nation's identity. As the Union pressed its advantage, the war became increasingly a test of persistence and resilience. Victory would not come from a single brilliant maneuver or decisive engagement alone. It would come from the accumulation of sustained pressure, the coordination of multiple fronts, the integration of moral purpose with strategic action, and the ability to endure the staggering human cost. Each battle, each campaign, and each moment of sacrifice contributed to a larger arc that would ultimately determine the fate of the nation, the liberation of millions, and the definition of American identity in the years to come, as generals, soldiers, and civilians alike learned that the true measure of war lay not merely in victory on the battlefield, but in the relentless pursuit of a cause that demanded everything they could give. When General Robert E. Lee surrendered at Appomattox Courthouse on April 9, 1865, the guns of the Civil War fell silent. but the echoes of its violence and sacrifice reverberated far beyond the battlefield. Victory had come at an unimaginable cost. Over 600,000 men dead, countless more wounded, and families shared across the country. The Union had been preserved and slavery had been abolished, yet the nation faced the daunting task of reconstruction, reconciliation, and remembrance. The surrender was a moment of both relief and uncertainty, a pause in the narrative of destruction, but far from the end of the war's consequences. The war's human toll was staggering. Entire generations had been exposed to violence and trauma on a scale previously unknown in American history. Fields were littered with the dead and wounded. Towns and cities had been devastated by occupation or battle, and the psychological scars of war ran deep. Soldiers who returned home were often unrecognizable to their families, limbs lost, health broken, and spirits weighed down by what they had witnessed. They struggled to reintegrate into communities that had changed in their absence. Women who had managed farms, businesses, and households in the absence of men found their roles shifting yet again, facing the challenge of rebuilding their lives amidst the ruins of war. For the formerly enslaved, freedom arrived as both a triumph and a challenge. Emancipation meant the end of legal bondage, but it did not immediately bring equality, security, or economic opportunity. Freed people had to navigate a society still filled with prejudice, hostility, and systemic barriers. They sought to reunite families torn apart by the slave trade, to claim land or work in wages rather than servitude, and to participate in a political system that had long denied them representation. Despite these challenges, the pursuit of education, community building, and political engagement flourished, signaling a transformation in Southern society even amid resistance from those who wished to maintain the old social order. The Southern states faced a dual reality of military defeat and economic collapse. Plantations, railroads, and cities had been destroyed or damaged. Crops had been burned, and labor systems built on slavery no longer existed. White Southerners confronted the loss of wealth, power, and social hierarchy that had defined their lives for generations. The psychological impact of defeat was profound. Confederate veterans returned home with a sense of lost honor, mourning not only the men who had fallen, but also the identity that had been intertwined with the Confederacy. Memorialization of the war became a central part of Southern culture, shaping narratives of sacrifice, valor, and grievance that would influence regional memory for decades to come. The North, too, faced its own challenges despite victory. While industrial centers and cities had largely been spared physical destruction, the war had left deep social and political scars. Millions of soldiers returned home with wounds, both visible and invisible. Families who had endured the anxiety of waiting for news now had to cope with grief and reintegration. Political divisions remained, particularly regarding the treatment of the South, the future of freed people, and the balance of power between state and federal authorities. The task of reconstruction required difficult decisions about governance, justice, and the redefinition of citizenship. For millions who had previously been enslaved, national leadership faced unprecedented responsibilities. Abraham Lincoln's assassination just days after the surrender created a vacuum at a critical moment. Andrew Johnson assumed the presidency, tasked with guiding a fractured nation through reconciliation and rebuilding. The challenges were immense, determining the terms of Southern reintegration, protecting the right of newly freed citizens, addressing the economic devastation, and preventing renewed violence. Each decision carried consequences that would shape the country for generations. The question of how to reconcile former enemies while ensuring justice and equality became one of the most pressing dilemmas in American history. The Civil War also transformed the American military and its approach to warfare. The scale and intensity of the conflict had required innovations in strategy, logistics, and technology. Railroads, telegraphs, and mass mobilization became integral to military planning. Armies learned to wage coordinated campaigns across multiple fronts, emphasizing supply lines, infrastructure, and communication. The war demonstrated the importance of industrial capacity and civilian support in sustaining military operations. Lessons learned on these battlefields would influence not only future American conflicts, but military thinking worldwide. Memorialization and memory became central to the post-war era. Monuments, cemeteries, and commemorations arose to honor the fallen on both sides. Communities sought to make sense of loss, to preserve the stories of bravery, suffering, and sacrifice. Newspapers, memoirs, and official reports documented battles and campaigns, create a historical record that would educate and influence future generations. Yet memory was often selective, emphasizing heroism and downplaying the horrors of war or the contentious political issues that had caused it. These narratives shaped regional identities and national consciousness in ways that were sometimes unifying, sometimes divisive. The legal and political consequences of the war were profound. The 13th Amendment abolished slavery throughout the United States, formally enshrining freedom into the Constitution. The 14th and 15th Amendments, passed in the years following the war, attempted to secure citizenship and voting rights for formerly enslaved people. These changes redefined the relationship between the federal government, the state, and individual citizens, challenging deeply entrenched social structures. Implementation was uneven and often resisted, but the foundation for civil rights and equality had been laid. Even amid ongoing struggle and backlash, economically, the war accelerated transformations in both the North and South. The Northern industrial economy expanded rapidly, fueled by wartime production and post-war growth. In the South, the destruction of the plantation system forced shift toward tenant farming, sharecropping, and diversification of crops. Formerly enslaved people became wage laborers in some areas, while others pursued land ownership and entrepreneurship. Economic recovery was slow and uneven, shaped by infrastructure rebuilding, labor system transitions, and the broader national and global economy. The war had ended slavery, but it had also created the conditions for a long and difficult process of economic adjustment. The social fabric of the nation was irreversibly altered. Families had been dispersed, communities destroyed, and social hierarchies challenged. Women had taken on unprecedented responsibilities during the war, gaining skills, authority, and confidence that would influence social movements in the decades to come. Freed people established schools, churches, and organizations that became centers of community life and political activism. Veterans associations, charitable organizations, and civic groups emerged, providing networks of support for those who had endured unimaginable suffering. The war had not only reshaped institutions, but also human relationships and societal expectations. The Civil War's legacy extended far beyond its immediate aftermath. It redefined what it meant to be an American, challenging the nation to reconcile its ideals of liberty and equality with the realities of history. It forced the federal government to assert authority over the states in unprecedented ways. It tested the resilience of democracy under stress and highlighted the consequences of unresolved moral and political conflicts. Generations would continue to debate its causes, its conduct, and its consequences, reflecting the enduring complexity of the nation's struggle with freedom, identity, and unity. The conclusion of the war did not mark a simple victory. It marked the beginning of a long, difficult journey toward reconstruction and healing. The Union survived, slavery ended, but the task of building a just and equitable society remained unfinished. Communities, families, and individuals faced the challenge of reconciliation, of remembering and learning from the past, and of forging a future in which the sacrifices of millions would have lasting meaning. The Civil War demonstrated both the capacity for human endurance and the profound costs of conflict, leaving lessons for the nation that would echo across generations, shaping politics, society, culture, and the very understanding of freedom in America. As it became clear that winning a war is only the first step in winning the peace that must follow. Thank you for listening, and don't forget to like and subscribe.